Welcome to Creepy Comfort. Tonight's chilling tale will take you on a journey through suspense and fear. So sit back, relax, and prepare yourself. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful escape. The kind of place you could go to clear your mind, to breathe deeply in the silence of the forest, to disconnect from everything. But when I pulled up the long, winding dirt road, something felt wrong. The air was thick, damp, with a chill that shouldn't have been there for this time of year. The trees surrounding the cabin seemed to lean in closer than I remembered, their long branches stretching like twisted fingers. I'd been here once before, many years ago, but I'd forgotten how unsettling this place could be. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired, that my nerves were getting the best of me. But even as I unloaded my bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The cabin itself looked the same as it had when I last saw it. A small, weather-beaten structure with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that hadn't seen use in years. The windows were covered in thick dust, and the floorboards groaned underfoot as if they were holding onto something beneath, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I set my things down, then went out to chop some wood for the fire. The axe felt heavier than I remembered, as if the very act of chopping it would disturb something deep in the earth. When I finally went inside, the air inside was no warmer than the forest outside. The fire sputtered to life slowly, sending small flickers of light across the room. I sat down with a book in hand, trying to shake the creeping feeling in my chest. But then I heard it. At first, it was just a whisper, so faint I thought it was the wind. But as the minutes passed, I realized it was something more. A soft voice, barely audible, threading through the thick silence. It was coming from somewhere within the cabin. I froze, my hand stilling on the page of my book. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaky, barely a breath in the cold air. Nothing. Just the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was nothing, but the whispers grew louder. And they were different now, more insistent. They sounded like they were coming from upstairs. I didn't want to go up there. My legs were frozen, my mind screaming at me to leave. But I had to know. I grabbed the old flashlight from the drawer and slowly made my way up the stairs. The wood creaked under my feet, groaning as if it was protesting every step I took. When I reached the top, I stood in the hallway, unsure of where to look first. Then I saw it. A shadow moved quickly across the wall, just out of the corner of my eye. It was fleeting, like someone was darting just out of reach, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I could feel my breath growing heavier, the air colder around me. The whispers had stopped, but the unease settled deeper into my bones. I turned to the room at the end of the hallway, the one that had always been locked when I visited as a child, the one I'd never dared open. And it was open now. The door stood ajar, the darkness inside swallowing the light from the hallway. I stepped closer, the silence now oppressive, a weight pressing on my chest. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and then the whispering started again. This time it was different. It was right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam flicking wildly through the air. There was nothing there, but the whispering. It was clearer now, louder. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze. There in the doorway of the room I saw it. A figure cloaked in shadow, standing just outside the light. Its form was indistinct, like smoke swirling in the dark. The face, if you could call it that, was featureless, just a blur of blackness where eyes should have been. My heart raced in my chest, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to speak, but my voice was lost, trapped in my throat. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow retreated back into the room. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, shaking the walls. I ran. I bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath. The air outside was just as cold, but it felt like a relief. The forest around me was still, too still. The only sound was the faint rustling of the trees, the pines whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something kept me here, a force I couldn't explain. The whispers followed me, still beckoning from the cabin, and I knew with a terrible certainty that the answers I was searching for were locked within those walls. The shadow hadn't been the only thing waiting for me. The next morning I couldn't bring myself to return to the cabin. It sat there, nestled among the trees like a forgotten relic of something long past, its broken windows staring back at me like eyes in a decaying face. But the whispers from the night before, they kept gnawing at my mind. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I had to go back. The cold morning air was sharp against my skin as I gathered the courage to step closer to the cabin. The forest felt suffocating, the pines towering above me like silent sentinels, watching every move I made. The ground beneath my boots was soft, the damp soil squelching as I walked, my footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of moss. As I reached the front door, I hesitated. The latch creaked in protest when I pushed it open, and the stale air inside hit me with a rush of musty, old scent. Nothing had changed since I left last night. The same oppressive silence wrapped around the space, like a heavy shroud. But this time, it felt different. The air was colder, and the walls seemed to close in, as if they were drawing me deeper into the heart of the cabin. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering nervously in the darkness. The house groaned and whispered under its own weight, like it was alive. I forced myself to go upstairs, the same hollow sensation crawling up my spine. The upstairs hallway was exactly as I remembered it, but the door at the end, now completely open, seemed to pulse with a quiet, disturbing energy. The shadows inside that room were thicker now, like they were alive, writhing in the dark. I entered, knowing I shouldn't, but unable to stop myself. The room was colder, much colder than the rest of the cabin. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as though it had been abandoned for years. Yet, there were traces of someone, no, something, living here. The faint smell of something burning, the distant echo of a broken clock, the strange markings on the walls. I walked deeper into the room, my breath coming out in frosty clouds. And that's when I saw it. The floorboards were disturbed, pulled up in a corner, revealing a hidden trap-door. It wasn't large, barely enough for a person to crawl through, but it was there, its edges frayed and splintered, as though something had forced its way through it recently. A shiver ran down my spine as I crouched down, reaching for the handle. The metal was cold under my fingers, sending a jolt through my hand as I pulled it open. Below was a narrow, dark staircase that seemed to descend forever into the earth. The air from below smelled damp and sour, like mildew and something much worse. A soft, unsettling noise came from the depths, a low, almost rhythmic sound that I couldn't quite place. I stood there for a long time, staring down into the abyss. I could hear it now, clearer than ever. Whispers. Not from the cabin, not from the trees, but from the very earth beneath me. Help. Help me. The voice was faint, but it was there. And it sounded like it was begging. Something, or someone trapped below, desperately reaching out for a savior that would never come. I couldn't resist. I had to go down. The steps were narrow, the wood creaking with every movement. The air grew colder the deeper I descended, and soon I was enveloped in complete darkness. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam seemed to do little to cut through the oppressive blackness. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps from below, rising up the stairs toward me. My blood ran cold, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then a voice echoed up from below, no longer a whisper, but a raspy, breathless rasp. You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have. The flashlight flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, I saw it. A figure. It stood at the bottom of the stairs, just out of reach of the light. It was hunched, thin, its face hidden by a cloak of darkness. But the eyes gleamed, bright white like burning coals, and they stared directly at me. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. My hand grasped the edge of the stairs, but there was nothing to hold on to. I was falling. I hit the ground hard, a sharp pain shooting up my spine. The flashlight rolled away, its beam spinning across the floor, illuminating a twisted figure standing just inches from me. I could feel its breath, cold and fetid against my skin. Its hand reached out, and I screamed, loud, desperate, a scream that felt like it would never end. And then, the figure was gone. The room was empty, save for the faintest whisper of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and shaking. My flashlight lay on the floor, its beam now aimed at the trap door, which was closed once more. The figure was gone, but something had changed. The house was no longer silent. The whispers had returned, louder, more urgent, and they were no longer coming from the walls. They were coming from beneath the floorboards. I could feel the change in the air as soon as I stepped outside. The forest had never seemed so alive. The trees towered over me, their twisted limbs stretching out as if to grab me, to pull me back into the cabin, into whatever cursed force had been haunting this place. I had barely escaped, my breath ragged and my hands trembling, but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The whispers, though faint, still followed me. They echoed through the trees, like distant murmurs carried by the wind. Leave, they urged, soft and pleading. But it wasn't a warning. It was a command. And as much as I wanted to run, something dark, kept pulling me back. The road that led to the cabin seemed longer now, more twisted, the path narrowing as if the forest itself was closing in on me. The cabin was a looming presence, its shape barely visible through the thickening trees, like some malevolent creature watching from the shadows. I didn't know why I was still here, why I hadn't just packed up and left when I had the chance. But I knew one thing. I had to understand what was happening. The whispers, the shadows, the figure I'd seen, none of it made sense. But I couldn't leave without answers. I walked back inside, every step feeling like it took more effort than the last. The air was suffocating, thick with dust, and the heavy weight of something ancient. The silence pressed in around me, deafening in its intensity. The trapdoor. I had to go back down. But this time, I wasn't alone. As I made my way upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet felt like it was being echoed behind me, too perfectly timed, too deliberate. When I reached the top of the stairs, I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. No shadow lurking in the corner, no figure standing just out of sight. But I could feel it. I stepped into the room, my pulse quickening as I moved toward the trapdoor once more. The floorboards creaked beneath me, their groans like whispers of the past. I hesitated before pulling the handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through my hand. The stairs descended deeper this time, and the darkness was absolute. No light, no air, just the weight of the earth pressing in from all sides. I shone the flashlight down, but the beam barely cut through the inky blackness, the edges of the stairs lost in the void. Then came the voice again. "Don't come down. Please. Stop." I froze, my heart in my throat. It was so clear, so real. The voice, hushed, desperate, had come from below. I wanted to turn and run, to slam the trapdoor shut and forget this madness. But I couldn't. The curiosity, the pull, was stronger than fear. I descended slowly, each step a labor, the air growing heavier with each movement. As I reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered once more, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The walls seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And then I saw it. A figure hunched over in the far corner, its back facing me. The shape was twisted, its form contorted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It was as if the very bones of the creature had been snapped and bent into unnatural shapes. Its head was lowered, its long, matted hair hanging over its face, hiding whatever horrors lay beneath. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, trapped by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure shifted, its head jerking up, and I saw its face. It was a woman, or at least it used to be. Her eyes were wide, hollowed out like empty sockets, the flesh around them stretched and cracked. Her mouth was open, but no sound came from it. Instead, there was a terrible grinding noise, like bones scraping against stone. "Help me," she rasped, her voice no longer a whisper but a tortured, rasping plea. I stepped back, my hand shaking as I reached for the flashlight, but before I could turn away, the woman lunged toward me. Her hand, if you could call it that, shot out, its fingers elongated and sharp, nails like claws. "Stay with me." Her voice was no longer hers. It was something deeper, older, filled with malice. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the beam of the flashlight flared brightly as I fumbled with it. The woman recoiled, screeching as the light seared her skin. The darkness seemed to shift, the air thickening with something foul, the temperature dropping rapidly. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, as though the earth itself was alive. as if it were hungry. The woman's form began to twist, her body cracking and bending unnaturally, as if being stretched beyond its limits. Her face contorted into a grotesque mask of agony, and with a final blood-curdling scream, she vanished into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but a suffocating silence. I ran. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my ears. I scrambled up the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. The forest was still, the trees looming like silent sentinels, but I could feel them closing in, pressing down on me. I don't know how long I stood there trembling until I heard it. A whisper carried on the wind. "You're not alone." I thought I had left the worst behind me. The woman, the creature, her twisted face, her shrill cry, and the suffocating darkness beneath the cabin. I thought escaping had been enough, but as I stood there trembling on the edge of the forest, I could feel it, the pull, the forest, the cabin, the curse that had wrapped itself around me. It wasn't done with me yet. The whisper had been faint, but it was clear enough. "You're not alone." I didn't need to hear it again to know what it meant. I wasn't free. I wasn't safe. Whatever had been released in that cabin was still following me, waiting for its moment to strike. The trees creaked and groaned, as though they were alive, watching me, feeling my fear. Every step I took away from the cabin felt like a betrayal, like I was leaving something behind that had already marked me. And I couldn't help but wonder if it was watching me now, lurking just out of sight, biding its time until I was weak enough to be dragged back into the dark. I didn't want to go back. The thought alone made my stomach churn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me there, something that wouldn't let me go until it had its way. The road home felt different now. Each mile seemed longer, more twisted, as if the earth itself had shifted, pulling me back toward the hollow. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, with only the sound of my footsteps to break it. I turned around, looking back toward the forest, toward the cabin. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, a shape in the distance, just beyond the tree line. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. But when I squinted, all I could see was the dark expanse of trees, swaying gently in the wind. No figure, no movement. But I wasn't convinced. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt eyes on me, unseen, but there, watching. The forest was waiting. I was sure of it. I forced myself to turn away, to keep moving, but the fear gnawed at me. Every rustling leaf, every distant crack of a branch felt like it was closing in on me. As I walked, my thoughts kept returning to the trapdoor, to the whispers in the dark. That voice, the voice from below. Was it real? Was it another part of the curse that had taken root in the hollow? I had to know. I had to go back and find out. The decision was made. I couldn't outrun it. No matter how far I traveled, I knew that cabin would always be waiting, its curse pulling me back. But if I faced it now, maybe, just maybe, I could end it. The next morning I packed my things and headed back. The journey to the cabin was slower this time, the familiar path now feeling more like a descent into something darker, something that had been lying in wait. When I arrived, the cabin seemed unchanged. But the air was thick, charged with an energy I couldn't name. It felt wrong, alive in a way that sent chills down my spine. I stood at the door for a long moment, my hand hovering over the rusty handle. I could feel the whispers again, creeping just beneath the surface, urging me forward. The door creaked open, but I didn't wait for it to fully swing wide. I stepped inside, my heart pounding with the weight of what I was about to do. I could hear it, the low hum of something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't hesitate. The trapdoor was just as I remembered it, sitting ominously in the center of the room, its edges worn and cracked from years of neglect. The air was colder down here, thick with the smell of rot and decay. I could hear it now, those footsteps again, dragging their way closer to me from beneath the floorboards. I bent down to open the trapdoor once more, the metal handle ice cold under my fingers. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, the beam barely piercing the thick fog that clung to the air down there. I had no choice. I had to go down. There were answers down there. I descended slowly, my breath quick and shallow, each step an agonizing eternity. The further down I went, the stronger the presence below seemed to press against me, a pressure building in the pit of my stomach. And then, the voice again. "Don't come down." It was clearer now, more desperate. A warning, or a plea. I couldn't tell, but I had to know. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides. I could hear breathing, shallow, ragged breaths, but they didn't come from me. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam danced erratically, as if it was being pulled away from where it needed to go. Then, the air shifted. It grew heavier, denser, like the atmosphere itself was changing. The walls began to pulse, slow and rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. The sound of breathing grew louder, coming from every direction now, as if I was surrounded. I turned toward the far corner and saw it. A figure hunched low, its arms stretched out unnaturally wide, its face hidden in shadow. But I could see its eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, burning like the flames of a long-dead fire. The face beneath was a blur of skin and bone, warped and twisted beyond recognition. And then it spoke. "Welcome back?" The words crawled up my spine, ice cold and suffocating. My stomach twisted. The figure stepped forward, dragging its feet across the floor, and the walls around me seemed to close in. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figure was too close now, its eyes locked onto mine, its twisted smile growing wider, stretching farther than should have been possible. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped. "Now you'll never leave." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against my chest as I stared at the figure before me. Its eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, bored into me like twin coals burning deep into my soul. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't obey. The darkness around me seemed to tighten its grip, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. The figure inched closer, its steps slow, deliberate, each movement unnatural, as though it was dragged along by some unseen force. The faint sound of scraping bones against the floor echoed in the silence, sending shivers up my spine. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves crunching in the wind. Now, you'll never leave. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, my mind reeling with a mix of terror and confusion. What was this thing? What was it doing here in this cursed cabin? Its twisted grin widened, the edges of its mouth stretching impossibly far, as though it was trying to swallow the very room around it. The walls seemed to pulse with a low, guttural hum, vibrating with a rhythm I could almost feel deep in my bones. My pulse quickened as I took a shaky step back, my breath ragged and shallow. "Why are you here?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The creature let out a raspy chuckle, the sound scraping against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "I'm here for you," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for you." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. Waiting for me. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and disbelief. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing as if considering my question. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, it stepped forward again, and the floor beneath me groaned in protest. I stumbled back, my hands pressed against the walls for support, but the creature didn't stop. It came closer and closer, its breath ragged and heavy, filling the space around me with an oppressive heat. "I want what's mine," it hissed. "What belongs to me?" Before I could react, it lunged, its clawed hands reaching for me, but as it did, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. The floorboards cracked with a deafening snap, and something deep beneath the cabin groaned in response, as though waking from a long, restless slumber. I turned, my body moving on instinct, and bolted for the stairs. The sound of the figure's screeching laughter followed me, echoing through the depths of the cabin. I didn't look back as I sprinted up the stairs, my legs heavy with fear, each step feeling like a battle to escape whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. When I reached the top, I slammed the trapdoor shut behind me. The air in the cabin felt colder now, the silence more profound, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. The floorboards creaked beneath me, and I glanced around, half expecting to see the creature standing in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, just the weight of the curse that lingered in every corner of the cabin. I should have left. I knew that now. But as I stood there, my pulse still racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing downstairs wasn't the only terror lurking in this forsaken place. There was something else, something worse. The floor beneath me creaked again, but this time it wasn't from the figure below. No, this was something different. A movement, a shift, a pressure that had built up slowly, quietly, over time, and then it happened. A sound, soft at first, like something shifting beneath the floorboards. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was beneath was trying to get to me. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear to the floor. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a whisper, low and ragged, like a breath brushing against my skin. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. I had heard it before. I backed away, scrambling to my feet. I whispered, "No, no, no." I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let whatever was beneath the floorboards get me. I rushed toward the door, my hand gripping the handle, but as I tried to turn it, I felt a sharp, searing pain shoot up my arm. The doorknob burned, hot as fire, and I screamed, pulling my hand away. I looked down at my skin, but there was nothing. No burn, no mark. Just the sensation, lingering like the aftertaste of something foul. I turned back toward the cabin, my mind racing. The door was the only way out, but it was as if the cabin itself had locked me in. I felt a cold, clammy sweat coat my skin as I realized the truth. The cabin wasn't just cursed, it was alive. The walls groaned again, the floorboards shifting beneath me, and I felt something move deep under the floor, its presence undeniable. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, and I heard it again, closer, this time. "Help me!" I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The figure below, the one I had tried to outrun, was only part of the horror that was buried beneath the cabin. Whatever was beneath wasn't done yet, and it was reaching for me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. The cabin had always felt oppressive, but now it felt alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. My chest tightened with each breath I took, and the cold sweat on my skin grew heavier, more suffocating. Something was in the house with me, something that had never truly left. The whispering under the floorboards was constant now, a soft, pleading sound that crawled through the room like a disease, infecting my thoughts. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more frantic, as if it was getting closer, reaching for me. "Help me!" The voice, raspy and broken, echoed in my skull, drowning out everything else. I staggered back from the door, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something rotting in the walls. I could feel the darkness pressing against me, closing in from all sides, like the very cabin was trying to swallow me whole. The floor beneath me creaked again, louder this time. I dared a glance down, and that's when I saw it. A small crack in the floorboards, just big enough for a hand to reach through. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but the crack widened, as if something below was pushing against it, desperate to break free. My breath hitched in my throat as the first finger slipped through the gap, long, bony, and unnaturally pale. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The finger twitched, curling toward the edge of the crack. Then another followed, and another, until a whole hand began to emerge from the floor. It was skeletal, its fingers thin and twisted, nails sharp like claws. The air grew colder, a bone-chilling frost creeping over the room as the hand moved, dragging itself closer to the surface. It was followed by another and another, until two hands were clawing their way out of the floor, their movements jerky and unnatural, like they didn't belong to a living creature. I turned away from the growing horror, my eyes darting around the cabin, searching for an escape. But there was no way out. The door was still locked, the windows were sealed shut, and the trap door was where it had all started. I couldn't go back down there, not again. But the hands, the fingers, they were only the beginning. The air in the cabin grew thick, suffocating, and a low, guttural growl filled the space. It came from beneath the floor, from deep in the earth, like the sound of something waking, something hungry. I could hear it, feel it, vibrating through my bones, It wasn't just the floorboards that were shifting now. The very ground beneath me was trembling, as if the earth itself was being ripped apart. The whispering grew louder, more desperate, the voice below pleading with me, calling my name. But it wasn't me. It was calling. It was calling for something else. Something I couldn't name, but something that was connected to me in ways I couldn't understand. I turned back to the crack in the floor, my eyes wide in terror, and watched as the hands began to pull themselves free. The fingers were longer now, twisted, malformed, stretching far beyond human proportions, as though whatever was coming up from beneath the floor was never meant to be seen by human eyes. A face followed the hands, a pale, ashen face, its skin stretched tight over hollow bones. It was a face I recognized, a face I had hoped I'd never see again. It was my own. The mouth opened, a gurgling, inhuman sound emerging from the throat. The voice, my voice, but twisted, distorted by something far darker, filled the room. Help me. It was the same voice I'd heard before, but now it sounded wrong. It was a mockery, an imitation of me, and the horror of it chilled me to my core. The face continued to emerge from the floor, its features twisted into an unnatural grin, and then it spoke again, its words dripping with malice. You thought you could escape, didn't you? I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me. But the thing, my reflection, my doppelganger, wasn't done. It pulled itself free from the floor completely, standing upright in front of me, its form still shifting and warping, like it couldn't decide what shape it should take. I could see the darkness in its eyes, the emptiness. It wasn't me anymore. It never had been. No! I screamed, my voice raw with terror. Get away from me! But it was already reaching for me, its long clawed hands stretching out with unnatural speed. My heart raced in my chest as I turned to run, but before I could take a step, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down to see fingers, twisted and long, clamping down on me, dragging me back toward the floor. The creature's laugh echoed in my ears, a hollow, empty sound that sent waves of dread through me. It was pulling me closer, dragging me toward the darkness beneath the cabin. No, I cried, struggling to free myself, but the more I fought, the tighter the grip became. The floor beneath me seemed to warp and shift, pulling me into the very earth itself. And then, just as my vision began to darken, a voice, my voice, whispered one last time from the depths below. Help me. And then, silence. When I woke, I was no longer in the cabin. The air was still cold, but it didn't have that suffocating weight it had before. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, a heavy silence that hung in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The earth beneath me was damp, cold against my skin, and I realized I was lying on the ground, not inside the cabin, but beneath it, in the darkness, deep in the woods. I shot up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around. Everything was shrouded in shadows, but I could feel the oppressive weight of something close, something watching. I was in a clearing, surrounded by gnarled trees whose roots twisted out of the ground like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The air smelled of earth and decay, like the very soil beneath me was hungry. I stood, my legs unsteady, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. How had I gotten here? Then I remembered. The thing beneath the floor. The pull. The dragging force that had taken me. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see dirt. But there was nothing. No sign of being dragged through the earth. No marks on my skin. But the strange sensation remained. The feeling that I had crossed into a place where reality no longer made sense. I tried to move, but the roots around me seemed to grow, stretching toward me like hands, slow but deliberate. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as I looked around for some sort of escape. But there was nowhere to run. The trees circled the clearing like silent sentinels, their twisted roots woven into the earth, creating a barrier that was impossible to cross. The ground beneath me shifted, a low rumbling sound emanating from deep below. My eyes widened as I realized that the roots weren't just growing, they were alive. They pulsed and writhed, as if something beneath the earth was reaching for me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. A sudden flash of light caught my eye, and I turned to see a faint glow emerging from the center of the clearing. The light flickered like a dying flame, but it was bright enough to reveal what lay hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just another illusion, the product of too much fear and too little sleep. But as I stepped closer, my heart skipped a beat. There in the center of the clearing was a massive tree, its bark twisted and gnarled, its roots extending deep into the earth like veins. And beneath it, beneath the roots, there was a hole. It was small, barely noticeable, but as I approached I saw something moving inside, a faint shimmer of movement beneath the soil. I felt drawn to it. A part of me screamed to run, to turn away, but the pull was irresistible. I found myself crawling toward the hole, my hands shaking as I brushed away the dirt to uncover what was hidden beneath. What I found made my stomach churn. There was a body buried there, half buried, tangled in the roots of the tree, its face contorted in an expression of agony. The skin was stretched tight, almost translucent, and the veins beneath it seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The body was alive, I realized, with a sickening lurch in my stomach. It was breathing, its chest rising and falling with shallow gasps. But it was as though it was trapped, bound by the roots, unable to escape. I reached out to help, but as my fingers brushed the body's cold skin, something moved. The roots beneath it twisted and shifted, and the body's eyes snapped open. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The eyes were hollow, black as pitch, with no pupils, no whites, just an endless void that seemed to suck in the very light around them. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out at first. Then, as if forced by some unseen force, it spoke, its voice a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through my chest. "You shouldn't have come." I pulled my hand back in horror, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The body's mouth opened wider, and I could hear the crackling of bone, the groan of roots as they dug deeper into the earth. The roots began to shift violently, and I realized that whatever this thing was, it was alive, and it wasn't alone. The ground trembled beneath me, the trees shaking as if reacting to the creature's awakening. From the hole beneath the tree, something else began to emerge, something far darker, far older. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath me began to crack, revealing a vast network of roots, veins of life pulsing beneath the soil, all leading toward the creature at the center. I had to get out. My body screamed for escape, my instincts kicking in as I turned to run. But the roots wouldn't let me. They rose from the earth like serpents, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me back toward the center of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to kick free, but the more I struggled, the tighter they became, as though they were feeding on my fear. The creature's hollow eyes followed my every move, its mouth still open, as if waiting for me to say something, anything, that would make it stop. But there was no escape. There was no survival here. The roots twisted higher, dragging me toward the thing beneath the tree, pulling me deeper into the earth. And I realized, too late, that I had become part of something far older than I could comprehend. The last thing I saw was its smile, the smile of something that had waited for centuries to be awakened, to feast on the souls of the living. When I opened my eyes again, the world had shifted. Everything was darker, more oppressive, and the roots had loosened their grip on me. But I still felt their presence, lurking beneath the surface, pressing against my skin like 1,000 unseen hands. The air was thick with decay, the scent of wet earth and rot overwhelming my senses. The woods around me seemed alive, each tree, each leaf, holding its breath as it watched me. I wasn't in the clearing anymore. Somehow, in the struggle to free myself, I had been dragged further into the forest. The trees here were even more twisted, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, their bark dark and sickly. I could hear the faint echo of something, whispers, distant yet unmistakable, threading through the branches. It was a language I didn't understand, but the tone was clear. It was a warning, a plea. But there was no one around, just the silence, broken only by the eerie murmur of the trees and the faint rustling of leaves. I stumbled through the underbrush, my legs weak beneath me, my body covered in dirt and grime. Every step felt heavy, like the earth was pulling me down, trying to keep me in its grasp. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as though my lungs were struggling to draw air from the suffocating atmosphere. There was something else, something following me. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. The shifting of the air, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. It wasn't the thing beneath the roots, but it was close. I quickened my pace, my heart racing as I tried to push through the thick woods, trying to escape whatever had a hold on me. And then I saw it. A clearing up ahead, faint light filtering through the trees, a soft glow that promised safety, warmth. But the closer I got, the more something inside me screamed to turn back. I ignored it. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to find out what was happening, why I couldn't escape. As I broke through the last line of trees, I froze. Before me stood a house. But it wasn't just any house. It was wrong. The structure was ancient, decaying, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Yet, there was an unsettling familiarity about it. The door stood ajar, as though inviting me in. I shouldn't have gone in. Everything about this place screamed danger, but something else, something darker, drove me forward. The closer I got, the stronger the pull became, a compulsion I couldn't resist. The house felt like it had been waiting for me, its walls watching, listening, as if it knew I was coming. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, and the silence was absolute, save for the soft hum of something humming from the walls. I couldn't pinpoint the sound. It was faint but persistent, like the distant buzz of an insect trapped behind the walls. I moved deeper into the house, each room darker than the last, the air heavier with the weight of something oppressive, suffocating. The furniture was old, decayed, covered in layers of dust, but there were signs of recent disturbance, footprints in the dirt, broken objects, and a trail of something wet leading toward the stairs. The staircase loomed in front of me, dark and narrow, leading up to the upper floors. I hesitated. I didn't want to go up there, but something in me urged me forward. My steps felt almost forced, like the house was guiding me, pulling me in with an invisible hand. Upstairs, the rooms were smaller, the walls closer together, and the floorboards groaned louder beneath my feet. I moved through the hallway, my eyes scanning each door, each shadow. There was no sign of anyone, nothing alive, but there was something else. In the farthest room at the end of the hall, I saw it. A mirror. It wasn't like the others. This one was large, framed in a dark, ornate wood that seemed to writhe and twist as though it were alive. I approached cautiously, my reflection in the glass faint at first, then clearer as I stepped closer. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't me. It was distorted. The face in the mirror was twisted, its eyes black, pupils dilated as though filled with ink. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and its mouth, the thing in the mirror, smiled. A twisted, grotesque grin that didn't belong on my face. "You shouldn't have come here," the reflection whispered. The voice was familiar, but hollow, like my own, but drained of life. I recoiled, stepping back, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed there, its grin widening. Then, with sudden, terrifying clarity, the reflection's mouth moved again. "You are already too late." Before I could react, the mirror began to warp, its edges twisting, bending like molten glass. I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the inside of the mirror, like claws dragging along the surface. The glass began to ripple, the image of my face distorting more and more, becoming less human with each passing second. And then I saw it. From the other side of the mirror, a hand, a clawed hand, shot out, grabbing the edge of the frame, pulling itself through. The fingers were long, twisted, with nails like knives, and the thing behind the glass let out a growl, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the very air around me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, and I turned to run. But the house wasn't finished with me yet. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the floor beneath me buckled, sending me tumbling into the darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was no longer lying on the cold floor of the house. The familiar, oppressive weight of the atmosphere was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet that filled the air. The dampness clung to my skin, the smell of earth and decay still lingering in my nostrils, but the trees and the twisted roots were nowhere to be seen. I was in a narrow, pitch-black hallway, the walls around me slick with something I couldn't quite place. The silence was absolute, unnerving in its stillness. No creaks, no groans, just the sound of my breathing, shallow and uneven. The darkness felt alive, like it was pressing against me, watching, waiting for me to make a sound. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady, and ran a trembling hand through my hair. There was no clear direction, no sense of where I was or what was happening. The last thing I remembered was the mirror, the twisted reflection, and that thing, the thing that had reached through the glass. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I could still feel its presence lurking just behind me, waiting to strike. I took a step forward, then another. My footsteps echoed down the hallway, hollow and distant. Each movement felt heavy, like I was dragging myself through thick, viscous air. The walls around me seemed to shift with every glance, their surfaces rippling like liquid. I thought I saw faces in the walls, faint outlines, twisted and distorted. But when I turned to look more closely, they were gone, leaving only the cold, blank surface of the walls. I moved faster now, my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse racing. The hallway stretched on, seemingly endless. The more I tried to move toward the end, the further away it seemed to get. It was as though the very structure of the house was shifting, pulling me deeper into its labyrinth. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. It was faint, but it sent a wave of cold panic crashing through me. I froze, listening. There it was again, closer this time. An inhuman, raspy sound, like something dragging its body through the walls. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, but saw nothing. Only the oppressive darkness, the twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Another growl, louder this time, closer. I spun back around, my eyes scanning the hallway, desperate for any escape. But there was nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of darkness. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder, thicker, and I could feel something following me now. Something in the dark. Something that slithered along the walls, its presence heavy, suffocating. Suddenly, a door appeared in front of me. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I hadn't seen it in my frantic searching, but now it was there, plain as day. I didn't question it. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I pushed open the door and it creaked loudly, the sound like a warning in the stillness. The room beyond was dimly lit, the flickering light from a single candle casting long shadows across the floor. The air was thick, stale, and the smell of damp wood filled my nostrils. I stepped inside, cautiously, my eyes darting around the room. It was small, cluttered with old furniture and discarded items. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the far corner of the room. A man, or at least it looked like a man. His back was turned to me, and his head hung low, his shoulders slumped as if weighed down by some invisible burden. But something was wrong. His body was too still, too rigid. I could feel it, a wrongness in the air. I took a step forward, my breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I took another step, my heart racing. The closer I got, the more I could feel the weight of his presence. It was suffocating, pressing down on me, like he was waiting for something. A wave of dread washed over me, and I instinctively knew I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have come this close. But something made me reach out. A desperate, irrational need to know what was happening, to understand why I couldn't escape. The instant my fingers brushed his shoulder, The room shifted. The air thickened, the temperature plummeting, and the walls seemed to distort, bending like they were made of paper. The candlelight flickered, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that danced across the walls. And then the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face me. But it wasn't a man. Its face was a smooth, featureless mask, pale and lifeless, its eyes nothing but empty sockets. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. It just stared at me, its head tilting slightly, as if studying me, analyzing me. And then a voice, my voice, whispered, soft and low, from the darkness around me. "You're not supposed to be here." The walls seemed to close in around me, and I backed away, heart racing. The figure reached out with long, spindly arms, and I could hear the creaking of bones, the snap of joints as it moved. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the sound was swallowed by the thick walls. And then I heard it, the scratching. It started softly at first, just a faint rustling sound, but it grew louder, more frantic. The walls around me seemed to breathe, the sound coming from inside them, crawling through the cracks, slithering toward me. I turned toward the far wall, my eyes widening in horror. A face, a twisted, pale face, pressed against the wall, its eyes wide and hollow, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. And then another face appeared, and another, until the walls were filled with them, all staring at me, their eyes empty, their mouths silent, but the scratching growing louder, more desperate. I backed away, my legs weak, my mind scrambling for an escape. But there was no escape. The faces on the walls grinned, their silent laughter echoing through the room, a sound that didn't belong in this world. And then, from behind me, I felt it, the cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. Thank you for listening to Creepy Comfort. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories.